Hi, welcome to today's video. My name's Paul. So today I'm just doing a little bit of charcoal sketching and also talking about perspective, linear perspective and aerial perspective. The goal of this video is to hopefully show that perspective doesn't need to be a very complicated subject. I know some people like to make it very complicated, but it doesn't need to be, especially when you're first getting started. Okay, so perspective. So two kinds of perspective we're going to look at. The first one is linear perspective, and then the second one is a thing called aerial perspective. So sometimes, well, perspective is one of those things that you can make as complicated as you want. But really, especially at the beginning when you're starting out, it doesn't need to be super complicated. And both linear perspective and aerial perspective, there's things that are familiar to us from everyday life in the real world, especially linear perspective. The effects of aerial perspective might not be as noticeable, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So first of all, linear perspective. If you want to create a realistic landscape with a sense of depth, then you kind of have to use linear perspective. You don't really have a choice. That doesn't mean that you have to use linear perspective. It depends on what your end goal is. If you're not looking for realistic landscapes, if you're looking for something more abstract or more sort of graphic design type of landscape, then you can ignore linear perspective. So what is linear perspective? Well, as I said, it's something that we're all familiar with from the real world. Imagine you're standing in the street and there's a person standing next to you. That person, give or take 1 foot or so, is going to be about the same size as you. And they'll appear about the same size as you. But then there's another person at the end of the street, and it's quite a long street, but that person, of course, is going to appear much smaller. And it doesn't matter how big they actually are relative to you, they'll appear smaller because they're further away. And that is what linear perspective is. Things that are further away appear smaller. So as I say, it's something that we're all familiar with. We see it every day, or pretty much every day of our lives. But sometimes when we start drawing things, we forget about these things. So we don't always use it when we're drawing and painting. So in the example that I'm drawing here, you can see in the foreground I've put in some like tall blades of grass or rushes, that type of thing. And in real life they're probably, maybe 30 centimeters, a couple of feet long, something like that. The hedge in the middle distance, middle background, that is probably 5 or 6 feet or a couple of meters tall. So it's much taller in real life. But in the painting, because the grasses are closer to us, they have to appear bigger. And then again in the example that I'm drawing here, the more distant hedge in the background, that's even smaller again. That's just a thin broken line. So remember to reduce the size of things as they get further away. The second type of perspective then is aerial perspective. And when you're dealing with, as here, black and white and greys, it's simple aerial perspective. Things that are further away are not as dark. So when we talk about values, we're just talking about light and dark and all the shades of grey in between. That's all artists mean when they talk about values. So basically with aerial perspective, distant objects, you'll only see the brighter values. The darkest values will start to disappear. If you're using color with aerial perspective, then you have to start moving everything, or most colors anyway, towards the bluer end of the spectrum. So grass will appear slightly bluish instead of green. So I hope that very brief explanation maybe helps. It's just worth remembering when you're doing landscape, especially landscape drawings and paintings, and you want to make something that's more realistic. Just remember linear perspective, things get smaller further away, and the aerial perspective, we start to lose the really dark values as we move further away.